Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines in History. Here we are right now. I believe we are on episode 19, which would be the third installment of our Iraq series. And today we're going to highlight specifically getting out of Fort Drum and getting overseas. If you haven't listened to the first couple episodes in there where I describe joining the military and getting ready for deployment for 2004 and getting up to Fort Drum, and getting ready then to get overseas for Kuwait, into Kuwait and Iraq, then please go ahead and listen to episodes 1 and 2 to catch yourself up. So for those watching on video, here's our second episode that we're doing, we're recording, but you can see in the background here, I'm in a hotel room. That's because I'm traveling. I'm at Fort Dix right now. Actually, it's McGuire Dix Lakehurst, which is a new joint base. But anyways, I'm at Dix for some training, and so the background will be a little bit different, but hopefully the podcast the episode will go just the same. Now, as we did the same thing last week, I'm going to have some pictures that'll help you visualize what I'm going to talk about here in the episode. And so feel free, head off to the Patreon site. I'll be throwing up pictures there as I describe some of the palaces and locations we were at and stuff like that. That'll really give you some context to what our rotation was like. So head over to Patreon. I'd love for you to support the show there. There's a little donation tier, just a couple of bucks a month, and you'll have access to some behind the scenes stuff as well as the pictures and things that'll go along with the episode. So Headlines in History podcast at Patreon as well, and you can always reach out to my website, headlinesinhistory.com. Get in contact with me, email me suggestions for the show or whatever. So. Okay, now that we got all that stuff out of the way, also, we're doing a lot of history stuff in the last couple episodes, but I feel like I haven't reminded anyone. Just remember, I may be in the business. I'm still doing this intel thing, but all of the episodes that I record and all the things that I'm discussing are all my opinions. I'm not speaking for the Army in any way. I don't speak for the intel community. I don't speak for the government. Obviously, I'm just speaking for myself. So these are all just personal opinions and personal experiences, okay? I feel like I haven't thrown that in there in the last couple of weeks. Just make sure we remind everyone. Okay, so let me address a couple of strategic things before we move forward into the specifics of the episode. Okay, the last couple episodes I've been talking about Saddam Hussein's behavior, what it was like when he was in control of Iraq, some of the decisions he made, and then why, again, our government at the time, the administration was supportive of an invasion of Iraq in 2003, and I've had some email conversations with people, and I've had some conversations offline, and I want to address just a couple of things that I haven't touched on in the previous couple episodes, okay? The first one is the oil question, and that is, people say all the time, I hear it all of the time, that we were in Iraq for oil. And let's just make something really clear here, that while we may have been there for oil in a sense, right? We were not there. The Brits, the Americans were not there for oil in the sense that we were going to take it, right? We were going to build oil infrastructure and we were going to take it from Iraq and we were going to use it for our own purposes, right? None of that infrastructure was ever built. Clearly none of that happened, right? That's silly stuff. But what does happen and what is real is that is something that we referred to before, and that is Iraq, along with its neighbors in the Middle East, are sitting on such a large portion of oil, and oil was used to make the world go round in the 20th century in particular, and still does really in the 21st century. And so it's beneficial to the rest of the world that if the oil prices are stable and oil production is stable, it just benefits everyone. And when you have someone like Saddam Hussein running around wild inside of Iraq, wreaking havoc, and then causing these oil prices to destabilize and production to slow or increase, this is a negative for everyone. This isn't anything in particular just for the United States. And so it isn't fair, if you will. It doesn't help anyone if we have maniacs like Saddam Hussein running around controlling what happens to the oil. Now, if you're one of those people that believes that, hey, the oil sits under Iraq, it's Iraq's oil, they can do with it what they want, it's nobody else's business, then whatever. Then, we're not here to have that conversation. I'm not going to have a conversation with you. It's not in a discussion I'm willing to have. There's nothing I'm going to say that's going to change your mind. But if you do feel like the commodities, the natural commodities that exist geographically within certain countries like diamonds in Africa or, oil in the Middle East, if there's a responsibility of the governments that are in control, or at least, political control of these things, that they have a responsibility to the rest of the world to ensure this stuff gets out everywhere. Not that they can't make money off of it. Of course, Saddam Hussein has every right to profit off of the stuff that's in his ground. It's the same way with diamonds in Sierra Leone, right? They have every right to profit off of this stuff. But it doesn't mean that they should have the ability to hold it, care for it, and then take it away from everybody else, right? That's not the stance of the West. The other thing that I want to address is the other reality. The other reality that I want to address is the mindset, the cultural and social mindset of the United States after after 9/11. The United States, in fact, most of the world the Western world at least, was a different place after 9/11. There was a fear that terrorists lurked all over the place, that they were around the next corner. I mean, I know people that for 10 years after 9/11 wouldn't fly in airplanes because they were so fearful that there was another potential attack around the next corner. And for a while, you could understand that. I mean, really, what happened on 9/11 was so jarring to the entire populace, right? Not only even just the United States, but to the entire, quote, Western world, that the politicians and the military leadership felt that that was their duty, and it is their duty, but felt really keenly and acutely that it was their duty to protect the people of the United States, and they failed on 9/11. This is what they think, right? This is how they thought. And so they certainly didn't want to go through that again, right? And we all know that for a long time, and I talked about it in other episodes, right? It was the official policy of the United States in 98 and after to remove Saddam from power, that he was at times trying to get his hands on weapons of mass destruction. We know about the yellow cake stories from Africa. And we know that he had chemical weapons. We know that he used them against his own people. So who's to think, aside from the discussion that we've had in the past about whether Saddam actually had weapons of mass destruction or whether the intelligence was right or wrong on that, there was a belief that he may want to get his hands on weapons of mass destruction, and maybe he just wasn't successful yet. Now, there's counter arguments to that. He just wanted people to think he was going to get his hands on it, whatever. But the perspective is, after 9/11, that we can't let something like that happen, right? We can't let Iran get their hands on nuclear weapons, right? We can't stand the fact that North Korea has access to nuclear weapons. And we certainly are not interested in Saddam Hussein getting access to nuclear weapons, okay? So I'm just adding another reality to the calculus at that time. Again, I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it's necessarily the right thing that the administration decided to do in 2003. I'm not saying it's what we should have done. I'm simply saying that that's another reality to be added into the decision process. We certainly didn't, the leadership at that time, Rumsfeld, Bush, they certainly didn't want Saddam Hussein to get his hands, if he didn't have it then, to eventually get his hands on a weapon that he would use either against his own people regionally or even the United States. Okay, so those are a couple of issues that I wanted to make sure that we address that I don't think we covered in the last couple episodes. All right, so let's jump right in to the movement itself, and let's get back into the personal story and how we got ourselves from Fort Drum and then into Iraq and what that really looked like. So, if you recall, what we talked about last episode is that we had this waiting period where we thought we were going to get out the door. We were done with our training. We eventually ended up in like Christmas time, January. But eventually, after the 1st of January, I want to say it was like the 3rd or 4th or something, we found ourselves back at Fort Drum, getting ready to get on a C-17, which is a United States second largest cargo aircraft. They could put either, military equipment in, or they could put seats in, and then they can carry soldiers or service members, airmen, whatever, all over the world. And that's the plane that we took. We flew right out of Wheeler Sac Airfield in Fort Drum, and off we went. If I remember, I think we actually landed in Germany to refuel, and then off to Kuwait specifically. So we were on our way to Iraq, but we had to land in Kuwait first. And so we did. We landed in Kuwait City, and Again, I don't remember exactly the day, 4th, 5th, 6th of January, something like that. And it was really a rude awakening, if you will. It was really shell shock, culture shock for anybody who hadn't traveled that much. And in my life, I hadn't traveled all that much. I traveled a little bit in the United States. I obviously had traveled for basic training and I traveled for advanced training, but I just didn't come from a family where we did a lot of traveling. And other than Canada and then Mexico, I think one time, I never really left the US. And so this was the first time that I ever went anywhere overseas of any distance and really experienced like a different culture, different weather, different all that stuff. So when we landed in Kuwait and we got off the plane, I just remember thinking like, it's just a different world, right? First of all, it's really hot. Even though it was January, it was still hot. I want to say it was like 80 or something. So you're coming from upstate New York, particularly Fort Drum, which is practically Canada, and you land in Kuwait and it's 80 degrees and you left and it was 20, that's a shell shock, right? And then at times, even in January, it got warmer than that, and it would get pretty chilly at night. I remember, when the sun would go down in the desert, the desert doesn't hold a lot of heat. So sun would go down in the desert, it would get pretty chilly. And if it were 85 or 90 during the day, you're talking about getting down to 50 degrees at night, which you're thinking to yourself, if you live in upstate New York, but, big deal, what's 50 degrees? But, you're talking about a 40 or 50 degree, 30, 35, 40 degree drop, Fahrenheit, drop from the daily temperature. It gets pretty chilly. You're putting pants and sweatshirt on and potentially even a jacket. I mean, it was really kind of it was a shell shock. It was a rude awakening to what life was like really on quite literally the other side of the planet. So anyway, so we land in Kuwait, we get off the plane, we take this little convoy from the airfield at Kuwait International Airport, and we head off to Camp Buehring, which was the name of the place that we were going to stay for a few weeks. And I can tell you that Camp Buehring is even still there today. So this was 2000, in the very beginning of 2005. So here now in 2024, Buehring's still there. Not every place that was open then is still there, but Buehring definitely is. So we take this little convoy there, we get all of our weapons and our gear and all of our stuff, and we get on actually civilian buses that were like contracted Kuwaiti civilian buses and take our little short drive over to Camp Buehring, and we set up shop. And this is like a transitory period. So they put us in a bunch of transient housing. They call it like a bunch of tents. Sometimes they had bigger buildings, but mainly it was just a bunch of tents. And I want to say it held maybe 30, 40 Joes with a bunch of cots inside the tent laid out and stuff. And all of our training was done, so we didn't really have a lot to do. I mean, there were some region and country specific training we had to go through, right? Like we did some counter IED training, for example, when we were at Fort Drum, right? We drove around in vehicles and we in vehicle convoys, and we trained and studied and practiced on defending ourselves, defending our convoy against IED attacks, right? So when we got into Kuwait, we watched some videos and went through a little bit of training. It wasn't anything challenging, but updated on what some of the threats were different, and if any of the IED munitions were changed, and some of the new tactics that the enemy was using. But other than that, we were kind of just really waiting, and we spent a lot of time doing what you do in the military often, and that is just sitting around and waiting for the next thing to happen. And it was so we did a lot of reading, did a lot of studying. Open up the laptop and you just kind of prepare, getting yourself is into the mindset really as an intel analyst as you can. And I remember Buehring being really, really, really busy, just packed. I was a sergeant. I was not a big wig. I wasn't an officer at that point, so I didn't really have any access to high level or strategic information, right? So I had no idea how many people were at Camp Buehring. I just knew there were a lot of people, but I do remember hearing through the chatter, right, through soldiers talking that Buehring was set up for a certain amount of soldiers. I don't remember exactly, 10,000, 8,000, something like that. And there were significantly more service members at Buehring at that time. It almost felt that way. It just felt like wherever you went, there were just a bunch of people. If you went to the PX or if you went to the Chow Hall, it's just everywhere. There were people. You felt like there was no breathing room to do anything. And, the Chow Hall in particular, I remember normally what happens in a military Chow Hall is you have, multiple meals throughout the day, right? You'll have breakfast meal, lunch meal, dinner, and then midnight chow being open for everybody who's working 24 hours. And remember going to chow, starting in line, getting there and realizing the line is like forever long. And then it takes forever to get in. You eat, you do what you got to do, you leave. But the line never goes down. And then we would get back to get ready to go to lunch, and the line was literally the same length. It was unbelievable. And what come to find out, the chow hall never closed, and it never even took a break to like transition between lunch and dinner. What they normally do is close the doors, clean up a little bit, blah, blah. They didn't have enough. The facilities weren't there to feed everybody. So in the normal process, I should say. So what they did was they just kept the chow open all the time, and they, throughout the day, they would change the meal patterns, and things would kind of shift from breakfast to lunch around that time, and then shift from lunch to dinner. But it was just always open, and there was always a line. It was crazy. But the American military does a pretty good job. I mean, there was always food there. It was always fresh, as fresh as you're going to get from being in Kuwait. Fresh fruit that they got locally, and yeah, it did the job, right? It was a lot healthier than fast food, that's for sure. But that's not to say there weren't a couple of fast food joints over in the common area, because there was like if I remember, I think there was a Subway, like a little Subway trailer, and there was a little Burger King trailer, if I remember correctly. And I remember ordering from there a couple of times just to get a break from the chow hall in the few weeks we were there. And I remember like the tomatoes and the cucumbers being really, really small, like just not what the diameter or radius, of the cucumber was really thin as compared to what you would expect really back in the U.S. And it's all because the vegetables were locally grown and stuff, which was great. But just another little thing where everything is just kind of different, But anyway, so we're just kind of hanging out in Kuwait, and we're getting ready to go up into Iraq. And again, a lot of waiting around. There was one instance I remember that kind of sucked. It was so there was always like duties around, right? They were always looking for soldiers to do something, to fix something or help do something or go somewhere. It was always happening. And at one point in the middle of our time being there, the wash rack needed some help. They needed more bodies to help wash vehicles. And if you've never been in a military wash rack, it's an interesting place. It's really just a massive car wash like parking lot that has car wash wands all over the place. And it's really only water, but you're not like soaping and waxing vehicles, right? But you're just washing off, military vehicles, 5 tons, deuce and a halves, the Humvees, whatever are there. And this wash rack at Buehring was running 24/7. I mean, there were so many vehicles coming into country and so many vehicles going out of country that it was just always open, always being run, and vehicles were being washed. And you have to do this because, you want to ensure that you get off any of the grass and dirt and anything that's, local to Kuwait or the Middle East. You don't want to bring back into the U.S. and vice versa, right? You don't want to change the ecology patterns of different locations. So, you just wash all your stuff before you bring it back. And they needed help. So I got picked for this duty, and we had to do it at night. I remember being a 12-hour shift at night. So we rolled out to this wash rack. We took all of our wet weather gear, tops, bottoms, boots, the whole nine. And they said, okay, listen, go to sleep for a couple hours here in the day, get back up. It's going to be midnight, and we're going to get ready to do this thing, and we're going to wash trucks all night long, literally all night long, until the next day. So, and we just spent, honestly, it was like 5 or 6 days just lying underneath these trucks that are just caked with mud and dirt, and we're just spraying. Everything was everywhere, and it was. It's just one of those duties, that you have when you're in the military that's just awful. And I remember we were helping a unit from Kentucky. I don't even know why I remember that, but it was a unit from Kentucky, National Guard unit, and they were having all their vehicles processed out. They had been brought back into Kuwait to be moved, or at least that's what we thought, brought back from Iraq to be moved into Kuwait and then back home because that unit was going home. But I remember being underneath these trucks with my friends, and we're washing out like grass and like sticks pine needles and things. And I'm like, we're looking around and we're thinking like, clearly we're not experts, but I don't see a lot of pine trees in Kuwait. And certainly don't see any grass. And So come to find out, the vehicles never went anywhere. This unit actually never left. The unit it did. The unit left Kuwait and went to Iraq, but the vehicles never did. And so they literally brought these vehicles over from Kentucky, covered in good old Kentucky mud and clay, and never got washed. And now here we are, this guard unit from New York, cleaning all this mud and Kentucky dirt off the vehicles and sending it back. And whatever. Just some of the things that happen in the Army, I guess. But hopefully that unit was happy that New York took care of them and they had clean vehicles when they got back. But so those are some of the things that you engage in, if you will, as you're sitting around and waiting when you're in the military. We had one other incident where a lieutenant took us on a little convoy. We had to drop something off while we were down there on another base, and you can't make this up, right? It's like life is stranger than fiction sometimes, right? This lieutenant took us on a convoy, and yes, he got us lost in Kuwait, and we were gone for hours and hours and hours. We were only supposed to be gone for a half an hour there and back. It took like 7 hours because the lieutenant had no idea where he was going. So of course we have one of those stories. I see, those are the kind of things that are happening when you're waiting. But eventually the day does come. Right? The day comes when everyone says, when the leadership says, let's get ready to go. We're going to get on the bird and we're going to fly north and we're going into Iraq and we're going to start this thing and we're going to start the mission. So the way it worked for us in this 642, the MI battalion and the rest of the division senior staff is we were going to get up there in two different ways. So we were going to drive in what they called the GAC. So it was the ground assault convoy. We were going to drive in this massively long convoy with hundreds of vehicles, literally drive right off of post in Kuwait and head directly north up the main highway through southern Iraq all the way up to Tikrit, which is eventually where we were going to go. That was the city that was the location for the division headquarters in the region that we were going it's Tikrit. And so the vast majority of the unit was going to drive in these vehicles in this big convoy, and then some of the other folks, some senior officers and some other folks ended up flying from Kuwait into Tikrit, and I happened to be one of those. And that's because we had some intelligence equipment on us, and we needed it for our jobs in country. And the Army was not interested in putting that equipment in danger, at risk driving up in a convoy, right? God forbid something happened and the convoy comes under attack, and now we have this intelligence equipment, potentially some of it's classified. We weren't interested in losing access to, right? So anybody who had a responsibility to carry classified equipment didn't have to drive up on the convoy. They got to fly, and I just happened to be one of those. So when the day came, a couple of my buddies and I, we get on a good old C-130. Dual propeller, fixed wing aircraft. It's the ones that you'll see in the sky that airborne folks jump out of the back of or jump out of the side of sometimes. And so we got on. It's the first time I ever flew in one and lifted off out of Kuwait and headed north to Iraq. And there were rumors, I remember before we got on, that, rumors because we hadn't experienced it, but that there was something called a combat landing. And it's designed to get that fixed wing aircraft out of the sky as quickly as possible, right? Because, one of the threats to, soldiers in Iraq at the time were surface to air missiles, right? They had the Iraqi insurgents and Al-Qaeda and others, they had access to old Russian equipment, sometimes even newer Russian equipment, but it's designed to shoot helicopters and small fixed wing out of the sky. Again, surface to air missile, air defense type stuff. And SA-18s actually specifically were the ones that were all over the battle space. And so one of the ways to mitigate getting shot out of the sky when you're flying around and getting ready to land is to get out of the sky as quickly as possible. So you have this combat landing where you fly almost directly over top of where the airfield is that you're going to land, and instead of landing slowly and coming down like you would in a commercial aircraft, you fly directly over and then you corkscrew down as quickly as possible, in as tight of a spiral as the plane will allow, so you can just drop as quickly as possible. And one of the reasons I joined the Army is because I was certainly not interested in flying. I was not a fan of flying at all. And so I needless to say, I wasn't too interested in the combat landing, and it was worse than what I thought it would be. I just remember having no idea when it was going to happen. I had no idea when we were over the airfield, but we're just kind of hanging out. And I remember all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the plane just shoots to the side and the nose dives, and off we go. And we're just now spiraling. And I remember almost like a roller coaster ride in the sense that there's so much G-force that you can't even really lift your head and you can't move your arm. You're just kind of like dealing with it as you go. And I'm like, oh my God, that was, for somebody who's not interested in flying, that was not one of my favorite days, but we were fine. Nobody was shooting at us, but it's, it's typical combat practice, really. It's the way you do things, right? The way you do business. So anyways, we ended up landing, and we landed at a place called Camp Spiker. Now, Spiker is just that. It was a camp that had an airfield just outside of Tikrit, and it was really large, the airfield itself. Not just even the runway, but I mean the camp itself. It had a large PX and had a lot of Air Force personnel there and stuff, but it wasn't the actual location that we were going to spend our time where we're going to spend our time at. So that was another place called Forward Operating Base Danger, just kind of like just down the road, right? But Forward Operating Base Danger, or FOB Danger, didn't have an airfield. So you can only really get to Danger if you were driving or if you were using rotary wing, so helicopters. So we landed fixed wing in Spiker, and then we transitioned all of our gear into Chinook helicopters, CH-47s, which are, the dual propeller, the large, heavier, when I say dual propeller, so they're dual motor. They can pick up a lot of heavy equipment, and they can also carry a lot of soldiers. So we got into a bunch of CH-47 Chinook helicopters, and then made the final leg, if you will, from Spiker over to Danger. And Danger was, again, like I said, the division headquarters. So in 2003, in March of 2003, when the initial invasion began, the 4th Infantry Division was the division on task of being there with the initial invasion, right? So they came in, and they knew that they were going to set up shop in Tikrit. That was a decision that was made prior to the invasion, and that they, out of a base in Tikrit, they were going to be in control of 4 provinces, right? And provinces is similar to a province in Canada and Australia, right? 4 provinces titled Saladin, Kirkuk, Sulaymaniyah, and Diyala. And we were kind of in the heart of what they used to call the Sunni Triangle. And Tikrit being the hometown of Saddam Hussein. He actually was born in a little village just outside of Tikrit, but nonetheless, it's basically like coming from Tikrit. And so anyways, the 4th ID was initially responsible for that location, and they set up shop, and they really built a forward operating base. Initially, they called it Iron Horse, right there at Saddam's presidential palace compound in Tikrit, and they turned that palace compound into a FOB, and they set up security, and obviously they built some wall structures, and they set up gates and towers and all these different things so they could secure the base, and the division headquarters could operate out of there, and soldiers would live in certain palaces, and we would work out of other palaces, and that kind of thing. So 4th ID was the division that was there first in OIF 1, and then that transferred a year later to OIF 2, and that the responsibility changed hands from 4th ID to 1st ID, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red 1. And the Big Red 1 made their changes. They updated things. They secured it even more. They, whatever. Every unit makes their kind of their foxhole theirs and makes it even better while they're there. And then the new unit comes in and does the same thing, and on and on and on. So 1st ID built upon what 4th ID did, and then 1st ID transitioned their responsibility to the 42nd ID. And so obviously we fell in on what the 1st ID was doing. And the FOB was called Iron Horse, like I said, when the invasion kicked off in 2003. And they left the name Iron Horse until 1st ID came in, and then they named it the FOB Danger. And Danger being just a title that's related to 1st ID's history, let's say. Okay, and the same thing is the case for Iron Horse. There's a relation to Iron Horse with 4th ID. And so when the 42nd came in, when we flew on these birds and drove in, and we were going to take command after this official transition ceremony, we wanted to change the name just like everybody else gets to change the name. We want to change it to FOB Liberty. Liberty being a connection to us. That was a title that goes back in the 42nd's history. And unfortunately, when our 2-star commander, our commanding general, General Joseph Toledo, when he put the request into his boss, the 3-star commander, the 3-star commander said no, because there was already a Camp Liberty down in Baghdad. It was much smaller, but it was already named Camp Liberty. And so the boss basically said, listen, there's already a Liberty. I know you want to change it. Not a big deal. Just keep it. So it stayed FOB Danger. So for both rotations, it was referred to as Danger, and kind of everybody really knows it as Danger, because after we left, the 42nd left, we ended up closing that base down. So it really never had an opportunity to be renamed again. So really just down in history, it goes down to FOB Danger, if you will. But so it kind of stuck, or it stunk for us younger soldiers who were like, oh, this will be neat. The 42nd will leave its legacy, if you will. It's our time here. It's our year in the box, and it'll be FOB Liberty. And we didn't have an opportunity to do that, and that kind of stunk, from a junior soldier perspective. But nonetheless, so we land at this location called FOB Danger. That, again, the 4th ID set up, with the 1st Infantry Division, built up even more. And I remember when we landed, it was on this like crushed stone gravel area that had been flattened out in front of this monster palace. I mean, it was huge. And come to find out, it was what was called the presidential palace for Saddam there in his hometown. But it was partially destroyed, right? It looked at it as if it was like bombed out, and that's what we called it. We called it the bombed out palace. And the first thing they said to us when we landed was, stay out of that palace. We know you want to go in there and take a look, and it looks kind of neat, right? But stay out of that palace, because it was unstable. And that was one of the targets that was hit during the initial invasion, right? When you start an operation, if you have air superiority like the U.S. did and the Brits did coming in 2003. Now, we set fixed-wing aircraft up to Tikrit and other major locations, Baghdad, obviously, and other places, and we hit strategic places that we thought we needed to destroy in order to, support the invasion. And it just so happened that one of those targets was this presidential palace at FOB Danger. Of course, it wasn't called FOB Danger yet, but at this presidential palace compound. And the belief was, because the Iraqi army was operating out of that presidential palace, and Saddam Hussein, he often traveled around the country every day in an attempt to stay one step ahead of anybody who may want to assassinate him, anybody who may want to hurt him. I mean, not everybody in Iraq loves Saddam. We've talked about how much of a bad guy he is, right? So there were not only other countries' intelligence services, but even at times his own people, whether they be Shia or Kurds generally, who wanted Saddam out of power. He knew that he had to stay one step ahead of everybody else. And so what he would often do is he wouldn't ask, right? He didn't ask anything. He would tell his employees, like the people that work for his administration, if you will, to prepare meals at multiple locations throughout Iraq every single day at each meal, but he would never tell anybody which palace compound he was going to. So he would just, other than his obvious, inner circle, so he would just show up one day for lunch and he would eat at this palace, whatever it was. And then that evening he may fly out or drive out, whatever, he's going to head off to another palace and he would have dinner at the other place. And again, he wouldn't tell anybody where they would go, but there'd be enough meals prepared all over the place. So he was ready to eat and nobody knew where he was going. And one place that he did that was this presidential palace right there on Danger. And so that being the case, and the fact that we had intelligence that the Iraqi army was operating out of there when they were defending after the invasion, it became a target. And so the presidential palace was not destroyed in the sense like it wasn't, you can see the picture on Patreon. It wasn't eviscerated, but you can see that when it was hit with one of the JDAMs, which is a very, very large bomb the Air Force uses, very powerful, that it really destroyed a big chunk of the building. And you can see that it would be pretty, unstable, and you wouldn't want soldiers running around inside of there looking around and saying, oh, this is kind of neat when the thing falls over, right? So it was kind of fenced off. And, needless to say, throughout our entire rotation there, you could probably imagine soldiers made their way in there anyways, just to take some pictures and stuff. But that's the first thing I remember seeing. And I remember thinking to myself, that this was, that this was real. And, I felt that way one time when I was into Crete, is when we were doing, or not to Crete, I mean Kuwait. I felt that one time when we were in Kuwait. We went through this IED training and we did mount training when we were at Drum, and it was okay, and it's Army training, and it kind of gives you a perspective and stuff, but it doesn't really give you the the feeling of reality, right? It's almost video game like, and you can really it's easy for you to separate between the reality of the world and then the potential fictional nature of this training. And I remember the first time the whole concept of being deployed and potentially serving in a dangerous place came when we were watching videos of recent IED attacks in Kuwait, and that limited training that we had. And, the videos were pretty graphic, and they were recent. They had happened within the last week, within the last couple of weeks. And the whole point was to show us the most recent, the most recent techniques and tactics that the enemy was using, that our adversary was using in country. And so I remember leaving that training that day after watching these videos and talking to some of our senior leaders and the trainers and thinking like, oh man, this is, okay, that's a little real. And you become a little reflective, and maybe you get a little quiet and you spend some time thinking when you're done that day. And that's exactly what I did. And I remember, again, the next time it felt real again was when we landed and saw that presidential palace, when we saw the whole front facade blown out and, a huge crater really in the center of the building, and looking at that thing and saying, there's some real stuff that's happening here, that potentially a lot of people died in that building, and it's only just a few hundred yards away from where I was standing in that moment, So, hey, welcome to Iraq. That's kind of what we thought. But anyway, so there were multiple palaces though all over this operating base, and it was pretty large. And when I say it, I mean the entire compound. Basically, the fourth ID and first ID had basically left the outskirts of the presidential palace in the same place that it was, and just used that as the security, the security walls, right? So what I'm saying is they didn't reduce the size of what was already a large presidential compound. They just soaked it all in and took all the palaces that were in there and kept it the way that it was. They just thought that was easier to do rather than build walls around palaces that they didn't think they needed, right? So it was large, even though not all of the palaces that were there in this compound were in use, but at least in use by us. And so, but nonetheless, so we land, we see this presidential compound, and that's the one we're not going in. And now we get into Humvees and we grab our stuff and grab our personal gear, and they drive us to this little building that I remember being just called Building 216. And it was on the water. And you may be thinking like, what do you mean water? There's no water in Iraq. And generally speaking, you're right. Minus the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two main rivers, and the reason why Iraq is the cradle of civilization, right? The Fertile Crescent with the two rivers of, again, the Tigris and Euphrates. But on this presidential compound was a man-made lake, and it was built obviously under Saddam, and I don't remember exactly when, but it was designed for leisure, and they put a bunch of fish in there so people could fish and they could swim in there and whatever. But it was kind of like a relaxing place where members of Saddam's family and his inner circle could spend time hanging out at these little palaces that were built on the outskirts, right on the shore, if you will, of like this large man-made pond. And it just so happened that one of the buildings on the outside of this pond, really right on up against the water itself, was a building that the units before us took in as sleeping quarters for the intelligence folks. So it was 2 floors, and they basically just had bunk beds spread out all over the place. And there was a whole bunch on the first floor, and then you walk up the stairs and just a whole slew of bunk beds on the second floor. And that ended up being just the place that we lived. And, we ran 24-hour operations. So half the building was sleeping during the day and the other half of the building was sleeping at night. And, just walked in and somebody pointed to a bunk and said, there's your bunk. And there's where you're going to sleep for the next, 10 months or however long we were going to be there at that point. And that was it. And we threw all of my extra gear on the top bunk, and the bottom bunk is yours, and welcome home, And, I remember looking, and another realism kind of hit me, because I remember looking at the windows, and they were all plywood, and they were boarded up, and, the glass was all blown out and stuff. And so they put all this plywood up there, and it was really dark inside. And the plywood was dual purpose. And one, they wanted it to be dark in there so soldiers could sleep during the day. But the other one was obviously because of shrapnel and other things, because they were, we were constantly getting mortared, or rockets, typically 107 millimeter rockets were being shot at the buildings all the time. And so we were, we benefited from the fact that we were living inside of a concrete palace with marble and all these other things that, they were pretty sturdy. And oftentimes when mortar rounds or rockets would come in, they would hit the palace and do very little damage. But certainly there were windows. And again, there was another time when I remember looking at the window and looking at the plywood and the broken glass in the bottom. And that was even closer to being home, or feeling like you were in, the real world, if you will, than it was the presidential palace, because the palace was hundreds of yards away. And I knew when I landed that it's like, well, I'm not living in that palace, and that's, not a big deal. And then you walk in, you find your bunk, and your bunk is, 15 feet away from the plywood window. And now you know why the plywood window's there and the glass is on the ground. And you're like, okay, now I'm even closer to the real world, if you will, the real deployment world. So, and you end up spending your whole 10 months there. That's what I did. 7 days a week. You sleep on your off shift, you work on your on shift. Obviously you come back, you sleep on your off shift, and that's it. And my leadership at the time had we really wanted to jump in head first, and we wanted to give it 100%. And so we worked 7 days a week when I first got there. There was no time off. It was, every single night, and I worked nights. And so every single night I had to be at work at 2100. You typically have to be there a little early so you can go through what we call a shift change. So you'd be there a little early, but you'd work from 2100 until 09. You do a shift change and off you go. And you go to sleep and you come back every day. And, had to adjust to the nighttime work schedule, but that wasn't all too bad. That when you do it plenty of nights in a row, for those of you that work nights, you understand it's not too challenging if you stick with the same schedule, but nonetheless. And so for the first, I want to say for the first 4 months, probably we did 7 days a week, and just going straight out. And I remember talking to my counterpart, the first week and a half that I was there, I was left seat, right seating with what the Army calls left seat, right seat, just spending time with the person I was going to take over for. And I was in the hot seat for a couple of days, and he was in the hot seat for a couple of days, showing me what it's like to do the job. And, we would get to talking, obviously, and he said, hey, so what's your schedule? What is your boss going to have you do? And I said, yeah, well, we're going to stick with your schedule of, 9 at night till 9 in the morning. And boss thinks that's smart. We're going to do that. And he said, all right, yeah, cool. I mean, and so how many what are your work days? And I was like, what do you mean? What are my work days? I'm like, we're in Iraq. Like I'm working every day. There is no off day. He goes, oh man, really? We get a day and a half off. He's like, you can't go 7 days. You're going to be wiped. You'll never make it the entire 10, 11, 12 months mentally. You'll never make it mentally if you literally are in this room 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you add on top of all of the other, stresses that are involved in a deployment, and just the fact that you're away from home and everything's uncomfortable, and you're getting shot at, like these kind of things. He's like, you're never going to make it. And so I said, yeah, okay, yeah, but whatever, we'll figure it out. And but it certainly became the case. And I remember my boss, Major Chris Saccone, who's a great guy, and he eventually said, you know what? Okay, this I think we got our feet under us, and this 7 days a week thing, I think it might be time to kind of loosen up a little bit. And again, I don't remember if it was 3 months or 4 months or whatever, but we started getting half days, and we kind of rotated the day throughout our teams, and so we would only have to come in for a half shift on our 7th day, and then we would get a few hours off to do whatever we wanted to do, and then shortly after that, it was a full day. So, which was really nice. So eventually it became, I think for me, if I remember, it was Sunday. Can't hold me to that, but so yeah. So one night you'd wake up at the same time I would normally go to work at 9 o'clock at night, but tonight I don't have to go anywhere, so I could just lay around, and I'd spend time getting on the phone and talking to friends at home or family at home, and or there was, I could read a book that had nothing to do with Iraq history or bad guys or whatever, right? Just get into some fiction stuff or whatever, kind of get your mind separated from what was going on every day. So that ended up being a welcome change eventually, but still, at the end of the day, you're there 10 months and it's 6 days a week, right? I mean, it's 14, 15, 16 hours a day. 6 days a week. And it ends up being that because, there's times that things happen. When I say it being that, I mean, 15, 16 hours a day, because sometimes you have to come in early because something happened, or, sometimes I was doing something, working on something, and I just couldn't leave at that time. So I ended up staying later, and it just happens, right? You're just in a fluid environment, and, certainly those hours collect, and it does become challenging, specifically mentally. So my work location wasn't too far away from where I was living, and you could walk there really. I mean, it was on this same compound location, and it was in another. When I say it, I mean where our workplace was in another palace that was huge, and it was almost as large as that presidential palace I mentioned when we first landed. Not as big, but close to it, and it was kind of up a hill and past the chow hall, and actually ending, it was on the back end, if you will, of the FOB. So if you just kind of visualize this compound, you drive in the front gate, and it's close to where the helicopter first landed, and as I described earlier, and the presidential palace is kind of right there in the front, and then the compound. The palace compound itself, it extends back behind the presidential palace, and then to the right and to the left, and there's all these other locations, all these roads, and eventually you get to the back end of the compound, and that butts up against a few different things. So it butt up against the Tigris River, and in part, and it butt up against a lot of farmland on the back end as well, and then in downtown Tikrit. So a part of the downtown city area. So our work compound palace was way in the back. And again, it was kind of up against the back fence / wall, if you will. And the reason they did that and they ended the security fence there is because we were way up, kind of higher in an elevation, way up on a hill, and then the ground dropped very precipitously down into the river and then off into the village. So there was no reason to really push the security much further off the back end of our work palace, because there was really very little way to get there. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't fencing or there wasn't fencing, because we didn't want people coming across the water and trying to get in, of course. But nonetheless, it was still, pretty much on the back end of the entire compound. And so when we would go to work, it just so happened, again, that not only was the palace on the back end, but our room within the palace, this big office room, which was actually a dining room when Saddam had it, and we turned it into this big office room. That office room was on the back end of the palace itself. So we had this open door that we could open the door, this big metal door, step outside, and we could look down into the farmland, and we could look down into downtown Tikrit, and then we could look up the river as well. And sometimes it was pretty peaceful, but it was neat too, because we also had something right there in our visual line off the back end of the compound, something called Iraqi Army Island. At least that's what we called it. And it was a bridge over the river to this to this like small looking island area, and there was an Iraqi Army training camp there, and the Americans and the Brits and others, the Germans were training the police and other things. But anyways, in this instance, it was the Americans, and they were training the Iraqi army to be the Iraqi army, the new army post Saddam, and that was going to protect the Iraqi people. And we were able to go on the back of the compound and watch them in the morning do PT, and they're doing their jumping jacks and running around and learning how to walk in formation and their uniforms and stuff. And so there was always some Iraqi unit out there learning how to be soldiers, and it was kind of funny to watch. And again, the river was right there, the Tigris was right there, but importantly was also a bunch of this farmland. And one of the issues that we ran into, one of the tactical issues that we ran into, was that the insurgency in where we were in the Sunni Triangle was most often former regime elements. That's what we called them. So basically Sunni Arabs who were part of the Ba'ath Party when Saddam was around, and they were now no longer part of the Ba'ath Party because the Ba'ath Party was made illegal. It was dissolved and no longer existed after Saddam left. And then anybody who was part of the Ba'ath Party was no longer able to work, no longer allowed to work for the Iraqi government. And so, long story, but it turns out to be one of the more, what's the word I should use? It just poorly thought out decisions, really, of the leadership at the time, and ended up causing a lot of problems. And increase the capability of the insurgency and the numbers specifically of the insurgency by getting rid of these individuals who no longer can work for the new Iraqi government. So a lot of them turned into insurgents. They were fighting against the Americans who not only kicked out Saddam, who used to pay their bills, but now they're keeping them from working again. And but anyway, so a lot of them are using this farmland on the back end of our FOB to shoot at us from. And they would do it in the back of pickup trucks. So they would weld together these steel like metal tubes that they would find either, again, 107 millimeter rockets or mortar rounds, and they would fire these rounds again off the back of these trucks. They would pull up very quickly, lob a few rounds over at the compound, sometimes at the palace, whatever, and then they'd take off. And the challenge was that, we had what we call Q-36 and Q-37 radar. This is counter battery radar that is designed specifically to pick up incoming rounds and then triangulate based on the trajectory of the round coming at you, where the round came from. And by doing that, then you can send artillery rounds. You can conduct counterfire back at the location from which that original round came. And it's the technology got better and better as the years went on. When I say better, I mean more quickly able to discern through calculation where these rounds came from. But it still takes a few minutes, right? Even in 2005, to pick up where that round is, do the calculations, look at it backwards, mathematically, and then have the United States load a round and put a round back down range where that originating round came from. And if it's in a pickup truck where the truck is literally just running up, stopping, lobbing rounds, and driving away, by the time we were able to calculate and shoot back, they weren't there. But there was, given the terrain at the time and the amount of the amount of personnel or lack thereof we had running around in these farm fields, we didn't, right? These are civilian farm fields. We didn't have soldiers running around in them. So we couldn't get back at them in time. And so, but you weren't going to do anything. So, we would constantly, and most of this happened during the first ID's rotation, we would constantly work on getting back more quickly and deterring these pickup trucks from shooting. But it never really ended up working. And it caused a lot of problems with the local farmers, as you might imagine. I mean, they're already upset that these insurgents, some of whom they supported, but most of them they didn't. They're just people they didn't know that were just using their farmland. They'd race through the farmland with their pickup trucks and tear everything up, and then they'd stop and shoot a couple of rounds at the Americans and take off. And they were mad enough at them just for doing that. Then you can imagine how mad they'd get when a bunch of rounds come in from the Americans, blowing up holes in the farmland and, you know, creating craters in the farmland, and that the insurgents aren't there anymore. And they left 3 minutes ago in the back of their pickup truck. So, you know, when the 42nd came in, we took command from 1ID. You know, we as a leadership team decided, you know, I wasn't in leadership at this time, so I'm just describing what the bosses did, but the bosses decided to approach this thing a little differently and stopped conducting counterfire in the same way and used different tactics, like engaging the farmers directly and doing presence patrols. So we would send infantry squads out into the farmland at irregular times, you know, at times when we had thought, based on some pattern analysis us intel folks did, pattern analysis of when these rounds would come in, and then we would send infantry squads out there, again, to be presence patrols to try and deter them from coming. You know, it never really worked in any real way, meaning it didn't stop the rounds from coming in completely, but it definitely disrupted what the insurgents were doing. And looking back at our calculations in terms of numbers of rounds fired at the 42nd, the numbers were down than when they were when 1st Infantry Division was there, again, because we just approached it a little differently. But nonetheless, regardless of whether the number of shots were down or not, they were still constantly shooting. And it wasn't just these pickup trucks on this farmland on the backside of our work palace. It was all over the place, right? They would fire from inside the village or from inside of Tikrit. They would fire from the other side of the FOB. So it was a pretty kinetic environment. You know, I remember my time in Afghanistan, and it was kinetic in Afghanistan as well. And when I was there for the 9 months when I was there, I was in Kandahar, which is in the south, and I was on Kandahar Airfield, which was a large airfield, and not only an airfield in itself in terms of the whole base, but the airfields, the literal runways and airfields were pretty large. So, but anyways, and where I worked and where I slept on the airfield was close to right where the runways were, and the runways were a target, a priority target for the Taliban and the insurgency in Afghanistan. So they were kind of constantly shooting at the runways. But I remember the amount of fire that we received in Iraq in 2005 was exponentially greater than what we were dealing with in Afghanistan. It just was a lot. Right. And the threat had changed while we were there as well, based on what was happening on the ground. In particular, when we were there in 2005, we had the run up to the elections. And it just happened to be the time, again, 2005, when we were there, was 2 years after the invasion, the initial invasion. And the grand strategy, the grand plan was to have elections. The Constitution was going to be written, it was going to be ratified, and then they were going to start to have elections after the ratification. And so that ratification happened very early in our time, and the elections happened while we were there. And so, as you might imagine, you know, the environment got significantly more kinetic when the elections were going on, because the insurgency, both the insurgents and former regime elements from Iraq, and then the insurgents from outside, the Al-Qaedas and others, ISIS wasn't a thing at this point, that they were looking to disrupt the elections. That was the whole point. They were trying to delegitimize what the United States was trying to get Iraq to do. They were trying to ensure that this whole thing didn't work, and they would do it by killing Iraqis. They would do it by killing Americans, and they were definitely going to do it when the elections were going on to try and discredit the whole process. And so my point being here that, you know, Iraq, as a whole, at least in my experience, the kinetic nature of the fight was much greater in 2005 when we were there, as compared to Afghanistan in general. And even though it was much greater, it ebbed and flowed within the time that we were there. I mean, elections were busy, it kind of drops, it goes up and it goes down based on religious holidays and a whole bunch of other things. But it felt like in living in 216 with the boarded up windows and the broken glass, and then working inside of the work palace that we were in 13, 14 hours a day, that we were getting shot at like all the time. I mean, that's really what it felt like. Was it every day? Probably not, but it certainly felt that way. It certainly felt like it was almost every day. It was certainly multiple times a week, that's for sure. And again, the what do I say? The decent part about it is that we lived in a palace and we worked in a palace. And so even when incoming rounds were on their way, if they got anywhere close to the palace, then if they hit the palace ceiling, if they hit the roof, if they hit the wall, if they hit just outside, if you weren't anywhere near there, then you were protected, because the concrete and the marble and stuff was pretty tough stuff. Thankfully, we weren't in a plywood building or anything like that, but it was pretty kinetic. And that farmland on the back end was one of our biggest issues, as I was saying. So, okay. So looking at the story, looking at the time, it looks like we're getting close here to an hour. So I think what'll happen is I said earlier we were going to do, I think, 4 episodes on the Iraq series, but it looks like we've got some more stuff to talk about, and I really want to transition to one of the more critical, key, and tragic events of the entire deployment. And I want to do it in its own episode. I want to do it justice. It's really just such a profound story that it deserves its own time. So I'm gonna wrap this up here today in episode 3. Give you a little bit of an idea of what it was like when we got there, and a little bit of the work life. Like I said, head off to Patreon to catch the pictures and get a little context of what some of this looks like. And then next week, in our next episode, I'll talk a little bit more about the work. I think we didn't talk about that. I'll tell you about what it was like to kind of be an intel analyst there, and some of the things we did on a daily basis. And then we'll spend most of the time talking about our real tragic story that we had. That's so unfortunate, but again, out of respect, really deserves its own time, and we're going to give it that. So thanks for coming again this episode. If this is your first episode, then I really appreciate you stopping by. If not, if you're a returning listener, then again, I really appreciate you partaking here and you enjoying the show. And if you'd like to contact me, like I said in the beginning, John Malik at headlinesinhistory.com. That's my email, or you can go to the website, headlinesinhistory.com. And again, I keep plugging the Patreon, but if you'd like to support the show, feel free to stop by. And so I told you also some administrative news here. I told you we're still going to do a collaborative episode with my buddy from Dark History. That is going to happen. Our schedules got a little funky, but keep that in the back of your mind. We are going to do a collaborative episode. It's going to be really interesting. We're going to do some American history stuff that I think will be fun. So I'll continue to put his show down in the show notes, and my episode with Ian Bick is coming out really very soon. If not this week, it'll be next week, most likely, given on how many episodes he has and that are coming. So my friend Ian Bick at the Locked In podcast, be ready for that. We talked mostly law enforcement stuff, but I talked a little bit of TikTok, which was really good. Really interesting. He had some really interesting questions there. So I'll put the links down to Ian's podcast as well in the show notes. So again, thanks for coming out. Thanks for putting up with me on the road here, traveling down to beautiful McGuire Dix Lakehurst and getting some good training in with the soldiers down here. And I look forward to talking to everybody next week and really sharing a tragic but unique story. And yeah, should be a good one. So thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.